Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host. For 30 years, he was the most powerful man in television. Every night, millions of Americans tuned in to The Tonight Show, watching him with that warm, Midwestern smile and quick wit that made him feel like a trusted friend in their living rooms. He looked like the kind of man who never held a grudge, someone who could laugh everything off. But the truth, Johnny Carson was ruthless. Behind the charm was a man who never forgot a slight and never forgave betrayal. He had the power to make or break careers with a single decision, and if you ended up on his bad side, you didn't just lose a guest spot. You were erased from the most important stage in entertainment. Some people crossed him in explosive ways, with public meltdowns or shocking confrontations. Others made one mistake, so subtle, they didn't even realize they were done until the phone call stopped coming, and the invitations never returned. And then there were the betrayals, the ones that cut so deep, they left scars for decades. This wasn't just television drama. For these stars, being banned by Carson could mean the end of mainstream fame. Some careers never recovered, some reputations never healed. Today we're uncovering 5 unforgettable names, actors, comedians, musicians, and even literary legends, who crossed the king of late night and found themselves permanently exiled. And trust me, their stories reveal a side of Johnny Carson most people never saw. Shelley Winters was no ordinary guest. She was Hollywood royalty, a 2-time Academy Award winner with decades of legendary performances under her belt. From A Place in the Sun to The Poseidon Adventure, her talent was undeniable. And for years, she was welcome on Johnny Carson's couch. In fact, she was often the kind of guest Rick Carson loved, unpredictable, bold, and full of stories that went beyond the usual Hollywood PR spin. But by the mid-1970s, Shelley's reputation had shifted. Yes, she was still a star, but she was also known for her volatility, and especially for her drinking. Colleagues described her as brilliant, but dangerous, someone who could light up a room one moment and completely derail it the next. And when she walked onto The Tonight Show stage in 1975, viewers at home had no idea they were about to witness one of the most infamous moments in Carson's career. From the moment she sat down, something felt off. Shelley was slurring her words, changing topics mid-sentence, and leaving Carson scrambling to keep the interview on track. At first, he did what he always did. He smiled, gently steered the conversation, and tried to keep the segment flowing. But behind the desk, his patience was wearing thin. Then came the breaking point. Carson made what seemed like a harmless joke, a quick quip about Shelley's weight, a subject she had actually laughed about in past interviews, but this time, it landed differently. Shelley froze, her smile vanished, and in a split second, she snapped. Without warning, she picked up her glass, a full whiskey, ice cubes and all, and hurled it directly into Carson's face. The audience gasped. Live television had just turned into a real-life explosion. Carson sat there, drenched in alcohol, stunned. He didn't yell, he didn't lash out. He simply called for a commercial break, his face tight with fury. What happened next wasn't seen on air, but everyone behind the scenes remembered it. Carson stood up, dripping wet, and stormed off the set without saying a word. For a man known for his cool composure, that silence was louder than any explosion. His staff later recalled that his expression was absolutely murderous. Shelley was escorted out of the studio immediately. She never set foot on The Tonight Show stage again. Carson made it clear to his producers she was banned for life, and the consequences were brutal. In the 1970s, The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment. It was the single most important publicity platform in America. If you had a film, a book, or an album, this was where you went to reach millions. Losing that platform meant losing your connection to mainstream audiences. For Shelley Winters, already fighting the stigma of being difficult, the ban was devastating. Her career never regained the same momentum. Years later, Shelley admitted she had been in a bad place during that time. In interviews, she even said Carson had every right to never forgive her. But the damage was already done. That one glass of whiskey ended a career-long relationship and left her name forever on Carson's blacklist. For years, Rich Little wasn't just a guest on The Tonight Show. He was practically part of the furniture. A master impressionist who could mimic everyone from presidents to Hollywood icons, he became one of Carson's most reliable crowd pleasers. Audiences loved him. Carson seemed to enjoy him. And by the mid-1970s, Little had appeared on the show more than 30 times. But then, something strange happened. One day, Rich Little just disappeared. No announcement, no dramatic blow-up, no headline about a feud. He simply stopped being booked. For someone who had been such a regular presence, the silence was deafening. Fans noticed, and even people inside NBC were confused. It wasn't like Shelley Winters, where everybody saw what went wrong. One producer later explained, with Rich, it was like he fell off the face of The Tonight Show without a trace. So what really happened? According to insiders, the ban had less to do with one explosive incident and more to do with Johnny Carson himself, quietly losing patience. Behind the scenes, Carson found Little exhausting. He was always on, slipping into voices, cracking jokes, and performing even when the cameras weren't rolling. For a guest doing a 10-minute segment, that was entertaining. For Carson, who had to deal with him through rehearsals, commercial breaks, and off-camera conversations, it was relentless. Carson valued authenticity in his personal interactions, and to him, Rich Little started to feel like a man without his own voice. Crew members even recalled Carson muttering, "Does he even have a personality outside the impressions?" That wasn't a joke. It was genuine irritation. And then came the real deal breaker. Repetition? Carson had an almost photographic memory for comedy bits. He knew when someone was recycling material, even if audiences didn't catch it. And after dozens of appearances, Johnny started noticing that Rich was dusting off old routines, repeating impressions he'd already done with only the slightest tweaks. To Carson, that was unforgivable. He demanded freshness, originality, and evolution, and he felt like Rich was coasting. Rather than confront him directly, Carson handled it the way he handled most grudges, silently. The booking team was told to stop calling him. If Little's management asked about another appearance, the excuse was always the same. The schedule was full, or the show was going in a different direction. The door was closed, but no one ever said it out loud. For Rich Little, the freeze-out was confusing and painful. Years later, he admitted he never got an explanation. "I kept waiting for the call," he said in a 2010 interview. "It just never came again." By the time he realized Carson had personally shut the door, it was too late. The mystery of his disappearance became one of the most talked about Tonight Show bans. And unlike other guests, who at least knew why they were exiled, Rich Little was left with silence. His career continued elsewhere. He was still successful in Vegas and other TV spots, but he never returned to the stage that had once made him a household name. And that was the most brutal part of Carson's power. Sometimes he didn't need an explosion to erase you. All it took was a quiet decision, and suddenly, you were gone. Wayne Newton was no stranger to fame. By the late 1970s, he was already Mr. Las Vegas, known for his powerful voice, flashy performances, and carefully polished image. And of course, he was also a perfect target for late-night jokes. Carson, who loved poking fun at celebrity egos, made Newton a recurring subject in his monologues. At first, the jokes were harmless. They poked fun at his Vegas persona, his boyish looks, and his endless stage performances. But Carson eventually crossed into more sensitive territory, hinting at Newton's sexuality in his routines. In today's world, those jokes might roll off, but back then, a rumor like that could derail a career, especially for someone who relied on conservative audiences in Vegas. For Wayne Newton, it wasn't funny anymore. It was personal. In 1980, Newton reached his breaking point, but instead of calling NBC or issuing a statement, he did something almost unthinkable. He stormed into The Tonight Show studios himself. Using his celebrity status to bypass security, Newton marched straight down the halls and right into Johnny Carson's office. Carson was caught off guard. He was sitting at his desk, reviewing that night's monologue cards, when Newton walked in unannounced. At first, Carson assumed it was a friendly visit, but the look on Newton's face told a very different story. According to multiple witnesses, Newton leaned in and gave Carson a direct warning. "You can make fun of my music. You can make fun of my hair. But if you ever make another joke about my sexuality, I'll kick your ass." That was the moment everything changed. Carson wasn't a man who scared easily. He dealt with hecklers, angry calls, and criticism from all sides. But a physical threat? That was different. Carson slowly stood up, towering over Newton, and looked him dead in the eye. In a low, icy voice, he simply said, "Get out of my office before I have you thrown out." The confrontation ended there, without violence, but the damage was irreversible. To Carson, Newton had crossed the one line he never forgave, threatening him personally. That same night, he gave a quiet order to his booking team. Wayne Newton was never to appear on The Tonight Show again, and just like that, Newton was gone. The band didn't end his career. He still dominated Las Vegas, but it cut off his access to the most powerful stage, Raw, in America. Without Carson's couch, he lost the ability to reach millions of viewers nationwide, and that limited his career far beyond the Vegas Strip. Newton would later say he never regretted confronting Carson. In a 2007 interview, he admitted he'd do it all again, even knowing the consequences. But in Carson's world, there was no going back. The Tonight Show wasn't just entertainment. It was Carson's kingdom, and threatening the king meant exile, forever. If there was ever a guest who seemed untouchable on The Tonight Show, it was Joan Rivers. She wasn't just another comedian who landed a lucky booking. She was Johnny Carson's chosen one. He personally plucked her from the comedy circuit, championed her talent, and gave her the biggest platform in television. For a female comic in the 1970s, when the industry was brutal and dismissive toward women, Carson's approval was like a golden ticket. Over the years, their bond deepened. Carson made her the show's permanent guest host, a historic first. And he didn't just praise her on air, he guided her behind the scenes too. He gave her advice, boosted her confidence, and even opened up his personal circle. For Rivers, Carson wasn't just a mentor. He became a father figure in an industry where men usually demanded something in return for support. But Carson never did. He believed in her purely for her talent. That's why what happened next felt less like business and more like betrayal. By the mid-1980s, Joan Rivers was at the top of her game. She had success, recognition, and a regular seat next to the king of late night. But she was also haunted by uncertainty. NBC executives had quietly made it clear that when Carson eventually retired, Rivers wouldn't be his replacement. And as she approached her 50s in a business notoriously cruel to aging women, she began to worry about her future. Then came the offer. Fox, the scrappy new network trying to break into late night, approached Rivers with a deal that seemed too good to refuse. Her very own talk show, airing directly opposite Carson's. The salary? An unheard of $10 million a year. But it wasn't just the money. It was ownership, creative control, security in an industry that could chew you up overnight. Rivers agonized over how to tell Carson. She knew it would devastate him, but she couldn't turn the offer down, and so she delayed the conversation, searching for the right moment, the right words. That moment never came. Before she could pick up the phone, Fox leaked the news to the press. Carson didn't hear it from her. He read it in Variety. For a man who had lived his life battling feelings of abandonment and trust, it was like being stabbed in the back. "She didn't even call me," Carson reportedly muttered as he went pale and walked into his office. He never raised his voice. He never made a scene. He simply shut the door. And when Johnny shut the door on you, it never opened again. From that day forward, Joan Rivers was dead to him. He erased her completely. Her name was banned from the show. Old clips of her appearances were pulled from compilations. Guest hosts were told never to mention her. To Carson, it was as if she had never existed. Rivers tried desperately to apologize. She sent letters. She called his private number. She even sent extravagant gifts to his home. Every attempt came back unanswered. Sometimes literally returned to sender. Carson never spoke to her again, and it wasn't just The Tonight Show. Carson's influence was so enormous that Rivers became persona non grata across NBC and beyond. Invitations dried up, friends went silent. Her career spiraled. Not just from losing The Tonight Show stage, but from losing Carson's friendship. Years later, she admitted the personal loss hurt more than the professional one. Rivers eventually rebuilt her career through sheer determination and resilience, but she never got closure. Even decades later, when asked about Carson, her voice would tremble. "He gave me my career," she said, "and I hurt him." That pain never goes away. Her exile lasted until 2014, 22 years after Carson retired, and 9 years after his death, when Jimmy Fallon finally welcomed her back to The Tonight Show. By then, she had fought her way back into the spotlight on her own terms. But the shadow of that betrayal lingered, reminding everyone just how deep Carson's grudges could cut. Truman Capote was a star unlike any other who sat on Johnny Carson's stage. By the 1960s, he had already cemented himself as one of America's most celebrated writers. Breakfast at Tiffany's made him a cultural icon, and In Cold Blood proved he could redefine literature itself. His sharp wit, flamboyant personality, and instantly recognizable voice made him a natural talk show guest. In fact, Carson liked having him on because he could hold a room with nothing more than a story. But by the mid-1970s, Capote was no longer the witty, razor-sharp guest audiences remembered. Years of heavy drinking and drug use had begun to take their toll. Friends worried about him. His productivity as a writer slowed. And when he showed up for a Tonight Show appearance in 1975, Carson and millions of viewers saw just how far he had fallen. From the moment Capote walked out, it was clear something was wrong. He was unsteady on his feet, his eyes glassy. His speech was slurred before he even sat down. Carson's smile froze, but his eyes betrayed his concern. This was not the literary giant the audience expected. This was a man unraveling live on air. At first, Carson tried to save the segment. He asked short, easy questions, giving Capote every chance to recover, but it didn't work. Capote rambled, lost his train of thought, and stumbled into inappropriate stories about Hollywood parties that couldn't possibly be aired under 1970s network standards. The breaking point came when Capote launched into a long, incoherent story that spiraled into territory too explicit for television. Carson, ever the professional, cut him off mid-sentence and threw the show to a commercial break earlier than planned. What happened during that break has since become part of Tonight Show lore. Carson leaned in quietly, his voice low and firm. "Truman, you're not well tonight. We're going to cut this short." Capote tried to protest, but his words were so slurred they only confirmed Carson's decision. When the cameras came back, Carson ended the interview within minutes. What was supposed to be a 10-minute showcase for one of America's greatest writers barely lasted 4. For Capote, it was a humiliation, and for Carson, it was unforgivable. The consequences were devastating. For authors, The Tonight Show wasn't just a talk show. It was the single biggest platform to promote books in the country. Losing Carson's couch meant losing access to millions of readers. And for Capote, already struggling with addiction and waning productivity, it was a career blow he couldn't recover from. His final works, including music for Chameleons, reached only a fraction of the audience they might have if Carson had still welcomed him. Capote's exile from The Tonight Show was one of the saddest of all Carson's bands. It wasn't about ego, insult, or betrayal. It was about a genius undone by his own demons and a host who refused to let his show become the stage for a public breakdown. And just like that, Truman Capote, once one of Carson's most dazzling guests, was gone forever. Johnny Carson will always be remembered as the smiling king of late-night television, the man who made millions laugh, night after night. But behind that smile was a man who held grudges with the precision of a scalpel. To cross him, whether by betrayal, disrespect, or chaos, was to risk being erased from the biggest stage in America. For Shelley Winters, it was a single drunken outburst that destroyed her relationship with Carson forever. For Rich Little, it was the slow burn of repetition and overexposure, ending in silence. For Wayne Newton, it was one heated threat that turned a joke into a lifetime ban. For Joan Rivers, it was a betrayal that cut deeper than money or television. It was personal. And for Truman Capote, it was his own demons that cost him his place on the Tonight Show stage. What all of their stories prove is simple. Johnny Carson wasn't just a host. He was a gatekeeper. The Tonight Show wasn't just a talk show. It was the beating heart of American entertainment, and when Carson closed the door on you, that door stayed shut. Decades later, people still talk about these bands because they reveal something most viewers never saw. Carson wasn't just the man with the quick jokes and the warm smile. He was also the man with the cold memory and the final word, and maybe that's what made him so powerful. He wasn't just shaping comedy, he was shaping careers, and sometimes ending them. So the next time you see those old clips of Carson, remember, the laughter was real, but so were the grudges. If you found these stories as wild as I did, don't let this be the last one you watch. There are countless untold moments from Hollywood's golden era, scandals, betrayals, and shocking secrets that never made the headlines. So, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because the next story might just change the way you see your favorite stars. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. It really helps more people discover these hidden pieces of television history, and I want to hear from you. Which one of these bands shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. Until next time, remember, in Johnny Carson's world, laughter was power, and crossing him could cost you everything.